It's a great pleasure to be here. The 100th anniversary of the Central Citizens Committee of Detroit is one of the great occasions in the history of our community. You have 3 different essays on the history of the organization in your program, and so there's no reason for me to repeat most of that. Excuse me, although I will allude to it. But I think one of the things we see as we look at the history of the Central Citizens is how amazingly adaptable the organization was. It assessed the needs of the community at any given time, and it changed itself to accommodate those needs, to help the community grow and prosper and flourish. The interesting thing is that the Central Citizens started out as a temporary organization, and from there became a permanent organization. And it went through several mutations that match the history of our community. When it was founded, Detroit Polonia was already 40 years old. And the second generation of Polonia was coming to maturity just when Central Citizens was founded. And I think one of the things we can do as we look at the history of Central Citizens is we can get some perspective on the issues that they faced. And the issues they faced were directly related to the changes that were taking place in Polonia at that time. At the beginning of the 20th century, America, Detroit, and Polonia were changing very dramatically. In 1870, when Polonia was founded, it was largely a creation of people from Wielkopolska. These were Kaszubs and Poznanians, and they made up the majority of the population. When Father Dąbrowski came here in 1884, and he was from Lublin originally, he arrived in Detroit and he looked around and he listened to the people and he said, "Oh my God, is there anybody left in Poznań?" People from the Królestwo, people from Austrian Galicia were here in very small numbers. But then right around the turn of the century, that immigration stopped and a new immigration started. Most of the energy in that first generation of Polonia was spent trying to create a community, trying to build institutions. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, those institutions were built, and suddenly there was a new influx of people. I think we can talk about a second Polonia being created in Detroit after 1900. And this was a migration not only from Poland in large numbers, but from the Polish lands under Russian control and under Austrian control. And a lot more single men and single women coming rather than families. The new Polonia that existed, that came to exist here, became one of the most working class Polonias in the United States. And that had to do with the structure of the industry. Suddenly the auto industry boomed. And there was no longer room for technicians, small businessmen, artisans. There was no factory in Detroit before 1900 that had more than 3,000 workers. Now suddenly you had factories that had 10,000. 15,000 workers. No skills were required. These were unskilled workers on the assembly lines. In Detroit in 1900, 1 out of every 5 people were Polish. And in 1900, we were beginning to elect people to city council. There were enough Poles. And the city council was made up of wards. And so we had representatives. And it looked like we were going to play a role in the city of Detroit. But we didn't. One of the things that happened was that as the Polish population grew, and especially as you had this large number of unskilled workers coming, there was a great deal of prejudice against the Polish population, which was just the largest immigrant population. Nobody could distinguish a Pole from a Slovak, from a Ruthenian, from a Czech. They lumped them all with us. One of the first things that happened was white flight. Detroit's elite left earlier from downtown than any other major city. They fled to Palmer Woods, to Boston Edison, to Grosse Pointe, to get away from all these new Polish immigrants coming. When I say white flight, I mean that. They asked a young African-American man in a story about an old neighborhood downtown around 1900, are there any white people living here? He said, oh no, there's some Polacks, you know, but they ain't white. We all became white somewhere around 1964, I think. But one of the things the elite did here is they imposed prohibition in 1916, 2 years before the United States introduced prohibition. Why? Because all those immigrants spent all that time in the bars and drinking, and they were considered dangerous people. They also changed the election system to at-large election. There were only a handful of people on city council, and they were all elected at large. Well, you know what happened? For the next 60 years, hardly 2 Poles were elected to the city council. There were actually 3, but one only stayed 6 months. We couldn't play any role in Detroit politics. They squeezed us out. Hamtramck, therefore, kind of stands out as a kind of interesting exception. This is the one place we could elect people. But Hamtramck in 1914, when the Central Citizens was founded, was only about half built. Holbrook was a stream. It was all farms. The houses in this area were just starting to be built. The north end of Joseph Campo didn't exist. The building where my institute was built in 1923. So when Central Citizens was started, this whole area was still farmland. And so you get some sense of the kind of world that they were dealing with. In the year the Central Citizens was founded was the year that World War I began. So they had a community that was changing very rapidly. It had all sorts of new needs. All sorts of new people were moving in. And they were becoming more and more conscious of their ties to Poland. They had built their community, and now they could look back on the world that they left behind. And the Central Citizens was founded to deal with a major flood that took place in Poland in the spring of 1914. All over America, Polish communities were raising money, raising donations of food and clothing in order to help the many thousands and thousands of Poles who had been displaced by the floods. And then the summer of 1914, World War I began. Poland was on the main battlefield in the east. We know, looking at the history of the war, and sometimes it doesn't enter our consciousness because Poland wasn't a country, but Polish soldiers were drafted into the armies of Russia and Prussia and Austria and sent to fight each other. The battlefield surged across the Polish plain. Probably 1 million people died, civilians, Polish civilians, during that war. More than 1 million were displaced. All sorts of atrocities took place. The committee that was started in Detroit to deal with the flood suddenly realized it had another cause, and that is the cause of Poland. And so they said, let's stay in existence. We've provided relief for the flood. Now we have an even bigger job, to provide relief for Poland. In 1915, they reorganized themselves from a temporary committee into a Central Citizens Committee. And in 1917, when the United States entered the war, they changed again and became the Central Citizens Committee. And they brought together all of the parishes, all of the organizations of Polonia to devote their attention to the issue of their homeland, of relief, and perhaps more importantly, to raise soldiers to fight. They became the major agency for recruiting soldiers for Haller's army. So their goals by 1917 were relief for war-torn Poland, a struggle for Polish independence, which now seemed to be possible, and recruitment for Haller's army. About 2,000 young men were recruited in Detroit to go to fight for the Allies, first in France, and then, as you know, Haller's army was transferred to Poland, where they fought the Bolsheviks. They created a whole new system here. They recruited people, they brought them together, they gave them speeches, they gave them a wonderful dinner. The ladies of the organization, which was created as the Women's Relief Society, then gave them a nice big box full of sandwiches and cigarettes. They wouldn't give those away now. And warm sweaters and other kinds of things they would need. And then they, after Mass, they marched them all to the railroad station and sent them off. And all of Polonia was involved in it. They were so proud of those young men that went out to fight for Poland. There were also many thousands of Polish Americans that were drafted into the war in the American Army. And they too received support and help from the Central Citizens Committee. After the war, they founded the Grey Samaritans, an organization of women, many of whom went to Poland to help in war relief and to help in public health. After the war ended, they now had to help the veterans. And so they met the trains coming in, met the soldiers coming home, fed them, helped them find a place to stay, and if they were from Detroit, helped them find a job. And this also applied to veterans of the American Army who came back to Detroit just in time for a post-war depression. And so one of the things they turned their attention to after the war was domestic relief. I don't think we realized how difficult things were in Detroit after World War I. There's a lot of unemployment, major depression. The Detroit Welfare Department wrote this in 1922. Detroit in 1921 and early 1922 was faced with a situation more serious than that which confronted other large cities. Unemployment extended over a longer period of time in Detroit and affected a largely recent immigrant population who had not yet been able to achieve that degree of economic security which comes with thrift exercised over a long period of time. So all of those immigrants who came to Detroit from Poland just before the war and who continued to come during the war from places like Pennsylvania, New York, the copper mines of the Upper Peninsula, farmland all over, farms all over the Midwest. These people found themselves unemployed and in great difficulty, and they had no resources. I always like to think that probably about half the population of Detroit looks back to Pennsylvania as the old country, because there was such a huge migration. Pennsylvania in 1910 had 16% of all the Polish population in the United States. In 1920, it only had 10%. Where did they all go? They went to Detroit to work in the auto factories. Helen Wendell, a writer and social reformer, visited Hamtramck in 1921, and this is what she wrote. "Please believe me when I assert there lies within our very gates tragedy and privation and sorrow, and these deplorable conditions have called forth no flood of commiseration, no deluge of merciful aid. In Hamtramck, starvation is of the slow kind, because the destitute contrive by some means to obtain a little food now and then, and by this uncertain maintenance to keep going. Their undernourished condition is offering less resistance day by day to lurking disease which attacks it. It is unbelievable on how little the people of Hamtramck subsist. We don't think of that, but it was a terrible time in the wake of the war, and all of these new immigrants with hardly any resources were facing a deplorable condition. She later writes that she wonders how Detroit people can be concerned about famished China or even starving Poland when we have our own starving Poland here in Hamtramck. And so the Central Citizens was confronted with this kind of issue. And again, they adapted. Out of the Central Citizens Committee came a spin-off, the Detroit Activities League, founded by Klara Świeczkowska. Klara Świeczkowska was one of the founders of Catholic social work in the United States. She was later named in her career as the head of welfare for Michigan by Governor Williams. She's a remarkable, remarkable woman. She built a wonderful camp for Polish children in Memphis, Michigan, and she was directly responsible for the building later during the Great Depression of a home for Polish soldiers, in the one that's in Utica. She took over St. Anne's Settlement House here in Hamtramck to help the people of Hamtramck. It had been founded by the Archdiocese of Detroit. She established another one on the west side, St. Elizabeth's, to deal with the problems that the immigrants faced, and especially the children. Even by the late 1920s, things were not much better. We often don't think of this, but in 1929, the city report on welfare in Detroit said that except for problems of old age, Poles were probably the largest group on welfare in Detroit. We don't like to think of ourselves as being on welfare, but so difficult, and this is before the Great Depression. So these Central Citizens in the 1920s had, as one of its goals, it adapted from its earlier aid to Poland, its help for soldiers, now had to devote itself to conditions of the Polish population here in Detroit through activities such as the settlement houses. Also during this period, it went into politics. The Poles had been shut out of politics in Detroit and elsewhere. And so they devoted themselves to the redress of the prejudice against Poles by Detroit's political elite. They joined the New Deal coalition, and thanks to their organizing efforts, by 1932, every single congressman from Detroit was Polish. They couldn't elect anybody to city council because of the way the system was set up. But they did elect every single congressman from Detroit was Polish, including the man who was the president of the Central Citizens, John Leszczynski. The others were Dr. Sadowski, who was also active in the committee, and the third was John Dingell. That family has held that seat from January 1st, 1933 to the present. They also said, you know, one of the things we need to do is we need to raise the image of Polonia and Detroit. And so again, they shifted, said we need to show Detroiters that we are a people with a rich and beautiful history, and that we have a magnificent world-class culture. And so they devoted themselves in the 1920s to cultural affairs. In 1926, they raised money for a chair of Polish language at the University of Michigan at a time when there were very, very, very few Polish students, Polish American students, at the university. But they wanted it at the flagship university in Michigan. They raised $30,000. It doesn't seem like a large amount of money now, But in 2014 dollars, that's about $340,000 they raised from a very poor community. They also served as the official spokes organization for Polonia. They welcomed General Haller when he came. They welcomed Archbishop Czeplak after he was released from prison in the Soviet Union. Detroit hosted the first National Polish Congress. They welcomed the new Consul General for Poland in Detroit. And so they were deeply involved in integrating the people of Polonia into Detroit society and telling Detroit, listen, we're not just poor immigrants. We're a people with a rich history, and we have much to contribute. During World War II, they again recruited for the Polish army, only now that recruitment took place in Windsor, and so they helped send those Polish citizens who wished to serve in a Polish army, as opposed to Polish Americans who were required to serve in the American army, to serve in, to join in Windsor. But again, they facilitated that. They created drives for relief for Poland and for Poles in exile all over the world. And of course, as always, they supported the soldiers. One thing they added now was to lobby for the Polish cause. And they became one of the key components of the new Polish-American Congress that was founded here. After the war, they turned their long experience in resettlement and helping people adjust to the resettlement of displaced persons and Polish soldiers. They provided relief aid to Poland. And most important of all, they publicized the Polish cause under communism, the cause of Polish independence. They were very active in disseminating the results of the Katyn investigation, in which the local congressman, who was also part of the group, Tadeusz Radziłowski, was an important part. And they resumed their cultural activities by the 1970s. As we've already heard, they were responsible for the statue of Piast. They were involved in the placing of the statue of Copernicus on the 500th anniversary of the birth of Copernicus at the main library. And of course, the Kosciuszko statue on Michigan Avenue. They helped to organize the May 1st celebrations. I don't think we can remember, or most of us can't. I was in high school. The great May Day celebrations on Belle Isle. They closed Belle Isle because there were so many Poles coming to celebrate May Day. And they brought in very important speakers. And in 1951, when Detroit celebrated its 250th anniversary, the Central Citizens helped organize the largest float in that parade. And Polonia had the largest delegation to march in that celebration of Detroit's 250th anniversary. At that time, we were still the largest single ethnic group in Detroit. In terms of culture, they helped to purchase the famous Oestreicher bibliography of Polish literature. There are only 3 in the United States. One at the Library of Congress, one at at Harvard, and one here at the Detroit Public Library. The cost was anywhere from $1,500 to $4,000. I'm not sure the sources disagree on that, but they bought that whole collection, the biggest and most important collection, annotated collection of all of Polish literature. They honored, during this period, the heroes of the Polish struggle in World War II, people like General Anders, General Sosnkowski, heroes of the struggle against communism like Cardinal Wyszynski. And they were deeply involved in the political life of Michigan. As you know, Governor Williams was one of their favorites, and he appeared here at the Central Citizens. They began this custom of awards to Polonia notables in 1971 and have carried it on ever since. When you look at the list, and I don't want to go on here, when you look at the list of the people who have received the awards, when you look at the list of the people who were presidents, when you look at the list of the men and women who were head of the committees, who were active, it's an amazing who's who of Polonia and Detroit. Just by threading the biographies of those people together, we could tell the history not only of Polonia, but we could tell the history of Detroit. This has been a very, very important organization. Now, the organization has to look for the future. Kind of taking you through the past just to get you started. There is a book by a favorite author of mine, the theologian, philosopher Jaroslav Pelikan, who wrote about tradition in the past. And he said, to move into the future requires a kind of leap of progress. A leap of progress, as he says, is not a standing broad jump. You're not standing here and jumping ahead into the future. No, he says, it's a running broad jump through where we have been to where we want to go next. In order to get ahead, to move into the future, we need that head start, and that head start takes us through our past. And we've got to take the best of it. And one of the things we have to do if we want to succeed in the future is we've got to include our honored dead in our discourse. We enrich the quality of our conversation about the future if we continue to talk to those who have built this organization, those on whose shoulders we stand. So I invite the Central Citizens to get ready. Are you ready to take this leap? It's time to take it. The next 100 years needs to be as exciting as the last 100 years. So I wish you another exciting century. 100 lat.